Um, I'd like to invite Robin Maynard. Oh, you're here. Okay. Are you people here? Yeah. What are we here for? Trayvon! We may be here for different reasons. You don't need to be ashamed to state it. We just, let's be honest with one another, okay? If you have different reasons to be here, you just state it. What we need is, we don't need no more hypocrisy. The system is already filled with a bunch of shit. Sorry for my language, probably the kids, but I'm emotional. So Robin, you give some love to Robin. She's very patient.
So I really wanted to talk today about, I think one of the larger reasons that we're here is not just because Trayvon Martin was killed. It's horrific, the fact that he was killed, but the other reason that I think that everyone is furious and why there's demonstrations all over the United States, and I don't know if there are others in Canada, but why this is so important is because his death was in effect state-sanctioned. And I think that it's that context that is really important for all of us to be standing up against, most specifically. This death was not something that was exceptional to the rule. It was not an exception to the rule. What it actually demonstrates is the rule itself. And we could give a lot of the differences between the Canadian and American systems in terms of the history of chattel slavery or gun laws or private property, but I think that the fundamental thing that is not different is that there's a fundamental disregard for the lives of people of color, specifically Black communities and Indigenous communities. In fact, it's more than just a disregard and a dehumanization of people, but often the Canadian state is actually mandating violence towards our communities, and that's something that we really need to remember. There's a long history behind these realities, but there's a long history behind the reason that so many of our lives and bodies are now considered disposable, and that began with the colonization of many of the places that many of our Black communities are from. If you look, for example, at the history of the Caribbean islands, you can see that during colonization, they wiped off the populations that were there almost in a massive genocide. In a massive genocide, and then brought Black bodies in boats, in cages, and brought people to work on sugar fields and for coffee, and all this was for private property and for profit. And this disregard of human life is something that continues now. We even saw this in earlier Canadian history, in the history of the KKK, that was sanctioned so often by the violence in the 1930s that took place towards the burning crosses in Black communities in the prairie provinces. And there has never been justice, and it goes on, and we still that this racial violence continues to this day. Since arriving in large numbers in the 1960s and 70s in Canada, Caribbean populations have been systemically impoverished. That happens more and more. The rates of poverty of Caribbean communities are actually getting lower each year. That's right. So the poverty is increasing, as well as the amount of people who are actually in prison. If you look at the statistics that just came out from a 2012 Correctional Officers report, you can actually see that the fastest growing prison population is Black and Indigenous peoples. They actually did a study that showed the amount of police violence that takes place. There was a study that took place in Ontario that said that even though Blacks are less than 10% of the population, 35% of police violent investigations were perpetuated against people who are part of the Black community. It's not just these structures that are so violent towards people, this history and this present reality, but it's also what it does. It's this sickness that prevails in terms of what happens to individuals, that there could be the Zimmermans of the world, of people who actually are filled with it's not just the dehumanization that happens, but it's actually also, it's hate. Dehumanization eventually leads to hate, and these ways that we structure our society makes it so that there's so much hate and so much urges towards violence. But fundamentally, the horrors of what happened and why we're all gathered today here is because of a violence that's structural and is not individual. This is just one really in a series of regular reminders of whose bodies matters and whose do not. When you look at the 500 missing and murdered Indigenous women presently at this time whose lives have just been lost, who are not seen as important. We understand this. If you look at the Starlight tours of homeless Indigenous people in the prairies where the police left them outside of cities to die. If you look at the police killings of Anthony Griffin, where afterwards they actually discovered that the police had been using pictures of black people as targets on target practice. That continues on to the killing of Kilem Regis, the black man who was tasered in his car, Mohamed Anas Benis, who was killed by the police, and Freddy Villanueva in 2008, whose killer actually is now a part of the SWAT team. And none of the people who've killed it, none of this violence has ever actually been punished in any way. So it shows us that there's just the true lack of concern for our lives is something that has not stopped since the history of the colonization of this country and since the slave trade. I think that what really is important for us today, though, is to remember that when we're asserting the fact that we are human, that's actually something, it seems very basic, but it's actually something that's quite radical. Because when we're asserting the fact that actually that we are human beings whose lives completely do matter, that actually challenges fundamentally the way that our society is organized. It challenges the fact that that means that when people of color overseas working in factories die on fires, and the fact that our prisons are increasingly filled with people who've really committed zero harm, and even when they do. I just think that it really means a fundamental reorganization of who's poor and why, and the kind of jobs people have that make them sick and where they have to live. So it's really strong that we're all here today, and I think that we're all just trying to assert all of our humanity.
Give another round of applause for Robin. I'd like to just introduce my sister Zina Mustafa, part of the organization, the co-organization with Emily, because a lot of us, when we got the news, people were like, oh, we must do something. And I think we're still there, even though we're here tonight, we're like, what am I supposed to do? Well, what I'm gonna personally state is that I think that if we each teach one, then maybe we can elevate, and then let's become creative for those that work in the system, for those that have privilege, for those that are white, right? A knowledge of privilege. Talk about it with your family. I had numerous beefs with friends, white friends, because when you talk about privilege, it gets really personal, you know. And some people have greater ability to talk about sensitive topics like that, but we need to go beyond denial and taboos, because then it pops in our face. So I'd like to introduce Zina Mustafa. She decided to organize this thing, to bring it to life with other friends, other allies, with Emily Eclair. Zina, let's give her a good round of applause for Zina.
Thank you guys so much. I think everybody is a little overwhelmed at the turnout right now. I don't think anyone thought that this was going to be as big as it was, and I think that that's something that we should all be commended for, just like the fact that people care. And I think it was around now that the verdict was announced on Saturday night, so I think that now would be a really good time to have a moment of silence for Trayvon, and maybe you could put your hoodies up if you've got them, and raise your candles or fists if you don't have candles, lower your heads, and can we just have a moment of silence, please? Thank you all so much. Next we've got speakers from the Babai Collective, so please give it up for them. Oh, I'm sorry, before that, we've got more food over there, and there's also water that's being passed around, so if you need to If you need refreshment at all, please don't forget to drink. It's really hot out right now. Oh, and first aid. First aid's right over here if anyone needs it. All right, give it up for the Bye-Bye Collective.
Justice for Trayvon Martin. Justice for
Trayvon Martin!
Justice for
Trayvon Martin!
Justice for
Trayvon Martin!
First, I would like to acknowledge that we are on Mohawk territory, and would like to express our sincere gratitude for this land. And I would like to thank the students of color for allowing us to speak today. My name is Julie. I'm here today to represent the Bye-Bye Collective. We are an anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, transnational feminist women's organization, and we are outraged of the outcome of the Zimmerman trial. Justice was not served, and we stand in solidarity with the Martin family, all the mothers who have lost their sons and daughters, and the people across the globe who are taking to the streets against this oppressive, white supremacist government and its justice system. Some argue that justice was served based on the facts that were presented in the trial, but for who? It is blatantly clear that this backward government and justice system let a man who shot and killed an unarmed 17-year-old black boy walk. A man who reacted out of his fear that stems from racial prejudices which are conditioned by that same system. Shame!
Shame!
The same system that oppresses our communities and murders our children here and across the globe. The same racist system that specifically targets Filipinos and other communities of color for cheap labor. The same patriarchal system that is waging a war on women, perpetuating rape culture, and is continually working to silence and eradicate indigenous communities, people of color, women, LGBTQ communities, immigrants, and other minorities. There is a war against us, my brothers and sisters. The Filipino-Canadian community has lost the lives of young brothers to this system, namely Jeffrey Riotica of Toronto, Mao Jomar Lanot, Duard Ponte, and Charlie Dalde of Vancouver, and many sisters among them, Araceli Lawagan of Calgary. Many more Filipinos live precarious lives, especially our women who face oppression in the public and private spheres. Women as a whole are disempowered at the workplace, on the streets, and in our very own homes. We also have to live with our daughters experiencing the same kinds of oppressions in the hands of patriarchy, while our sons are racially profiled and harassed and beaten in the streets of Montreal by the SPVM. Shame! Shame! Shame!
Shame!
It's not enough anymore to sympathize or to be angry. We the people need to take matters into our own hands. We need to educate, organize, and mobilize our communities and work together in changing the way our society thinks. By any means necessary to fight against the injustices of this patriarchal white supremacist system. There is no justice, it's just us. We will not be silenced. Stop killing our children. End systemic racism. Justice for
Trayvon Martin!
Justice for
Trayvon Martin!
the people say guilty. The people say
Guilty!
The people say
Guilty!
The people say
Guilty!
The women say
Guilty!
The women say
Guilty!
The women say
Guilty!
down with the bourgeois justice system. Thank you.
Thank you guys. Give it up one more time for the Bye-Bye Collective.